So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
Julian Vance laughed as he poured the vintage Bordeaux over Elena's silk dress in front of the gala guests. The deep red liquid bloomed across her midsection like a fresh wound, the cold moisture seeping through the expensive fabric and clinging to her skin. For a moment, the only sound in the grand ballroom of the Vance estate was the rhythmic drip-drop of wine hitting the polished marble floor. "Oh, Elena," he said, his voice carrying perfectly to the circle of socialites and board members surrounding them. He didn't look sorry, he looked exhilarated. "You always were a bit clumsy. Perhaps you've spent too much time in the archives and forgotten how to carry yourself in polite company." Elena Vance didn't flinch. She felt the eyes of the city's elite crawling over her, heavy with a mixture of pity and predatory amusement. Beside Julian, Serena Vance let out a sharp, melodic giggle, her hand rising to adjust a diamond earring that probably cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Claire Vance stood just a step behind them, her face a mask of practiced, icy disappointment as she smoothed the front of her Chanel suit. "It's a shame," Serena whispered, loud enough for the mayor's wife to hear. That white was actually doing wonders for her complexion. Now she just looks stained, like she belongs in the kitchen rather than the ballroom. The scent of the wine was cloying, tart, fermented, and expensive. Elena took a slow, steady breath, her gaze fixed on the silk tie Julian wore. It was a Windsor knot, perfect and arrogant. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, a familiar spark of indignation, but she forced it down into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She had spent years playing the role of the quiet, dutiful daughter-in-law, the one who organized the files and kept the family's legacy polished while Julian played at being a titan of industry. "It's just a dress, Julian," she said, her voice remarkably level. "It's a metaphor, Elena," he countered, stepping closer until she could smell the scotch on his breath beneath the mint. He lowered his voice, though not enough to grant her true privacy. "You've become a liability. All this poking around into the Foundation's old ledgers. It's tiresome. People are starting to wonder why the help is acting like they own the place." He reached out, his fingers grazing the wet silk of her shoulder with a mocking pat. The touch made her skin crawl. Behind him, Marcus Thorne stood near the buffet line, his expression unreadable, though his eyes met hers for a fleeting second. He was the only one in the room who knew what she had discovered in those ledgers. "I think it's time you retired for the evening," Claire added, her tone final. "We have investors to impress, and you're hardly a vision of Vance excellence right now." Elena glanced around the room. Arthur Vance was nowhere to be seen, likely tucked away in the library, unaware that his son was currently treating the family name like a personal playground. She looked at the witnesses, the CFO of Vance Enterprises, a pair of local judges, and the city's most influential columnist. They were all watching, waiting to see if she would break. Instead of crying, Elena reached into her small, dry clutch. Her fingers brushed against the cold, metallic edge of the encrypted flash drive Marcus had handed her in the shadows of the coach room 20 minutes ago. It was a small weight, but in this room, it was heavier than Julian's ego. "You're right, Julian," she said, stepping back so the wine wouldn't drip onto her shoes. "I don't belong here, not like this." Julian smirked, turning back to the mayor. "See, even she knows when she's beaten. Someone get a rag for the floor. We wouldn't want anyone important to slip." The laughter followed her as she turned and walked toward the grand staircase. Her heels clicked against the marble, a sharp, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. She didn't look back at the wine-stained floor or the man who thought he had just put her in her place. As she reached the first landing, she paused, hidden from the main floor by a massive arrangement of white lilies. The scent of the flowers was funereal. She pulled out her phone and tapped a single name in her contacts. "Arthur," she whispered when the line picked up. "It's Elena. I think it's time we discuss the audit. Julian just made it very clear that he isn't interested in the truth." She listened to the silence on the other end of the line for a moment before Arthur's gravelly voice responded. "He went too far tonight, didn't he?" "He thinks he's untouchable," Elena said, looking down at the red stain on her dress. It didn't feel like a humiliation anymore. It felt like a war paint. He thinks I'm just a clumsy girl who can be washed away. And what do you think, Elena? She gripped the railing, her knuckles white. Below, she could hear Julian's boisterous laugh echoing through the hall, celebrating a victory that hadn't even begun. I think, she said, her voice dropping to a cold, predatory whisper, that I'm going to take everything he thinks he owns, starting with that chair at the head of the table. She ended the call and didn't head for her bedroom. Instead, she turned toward the service corridor that led to the private study. The gala would continue for hours, filled with champagne and lies. But by the time the sun rose, the Vance family would realize that the woman they had just publicly shamed was the only one holding the keys to their kingdom. Elena felt the dampness of the wine against her skin, a lingering sting of Julian's arrogance. She didn't mind the stain. It was a small price to pay for the look she knew would be on his face when he realized he hadn't just spilled wine. He had spilled blood. And in this house, the walls were already beginning to close in. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the breakfast room, illuminating the dust motes dancing over a spread of smoked salmon and imported berries. Elena Vance entered the room, her movements fluid and silent. She had traded the ruined silk gown for a tailored charcoal suit that felt like armor. Her skin still felt the phantom sting of the wine Julian had thrown, but her eyes were as clear as mountain water. Julian Vance was already seated at the head of the table, his face buried in a tablet. He didn't look up as she pulled out a chair. The only sound was the rhythmic, irritating clink of his silver spoon against a bowl of bone china. The dry cleaner called, he remarked, his voice flat and devoid of apology. The stain on that dress is permanent. I've already instructed the house staff to deduct the cost from your monthly allowance. We can't have you wasting family resources on clothes you can't even keep clean for a single evening. Elena reached for the coffee carafe, the smell of bitter, expensive espresso filling the space between them. The wine didn't jump onto the silk by itself, Julian. He finally looked up, his lip curling in a practiced sneer of entitlement. It wouldn't have happened if you weren't standing in the way of progress. You were an eyesore at that gala, Elena. Mother and Serena agree. Your presence is becoming a liability to the brand. Right on cue, Serena Vance sauntered into the room, draped in a silk robe that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She reached over Elena's shoulder, plucking a grape from her plate without asking. Oh, is she still talking about the dress? Serena laughed, the sound sharp and grating. Honestly, Elena, you should be thanking Julian. That outfit was 3 seasons out of date. He did the fashion world a favor. Claire Vance followed closely behind, her expression one of cold, aristocratic disappointment. She sat down and adjusted her pearls, not even glancing at her daughter-in-law. Julian is right. We have the Legacy Initiative launch in 3 days. I've decided it's best if you stay at the estate for that event. We need the press to focus on the family's strength, not your unfortunate lack of poise. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with their collective arrogance. They spoke about her as if she were a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. Elena felt the familiar heat of rage rising in her chest, but she channeled it downward, into the hidden strength she had been cultivating in the dark. 3 days, Elena said softly, her voice steady. The board meeting is right after the launch, isn't it? Julian smirked, returning his gaze to his tablet. Not that it concerns you. I've already secured the proxies. By the end of the week, I'll be the sole managing director. You'll just be a silent passenger in this house, exactly where you belong. Elena didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply stood up, leaving her breakfast untouched. She had work to do. An hour later, she sat in the back of a nondescript sedan parked 3 blocks away from the Vance corporate towers. The air in the car was cool and smelled of old leather and ozone. Beside her sat Marcus Thorne, a man whose sharp eyes and silver-rimmed glasses suggested a mind that dealt only in cold, hard facts. "Did you get it?" she asked. Marcus handed her a small, encrypted flash drive. The metal felt ice-cold against her palm. It took all night to bypass the secondary firewalls Julian set up. He's been clever, Elena. He's been moving funds through 3 different shell companies registered in the Caymans, all disguised as consulting fees for the Legacy Initiative. Elena gripped the drive, her knuckles white. How much has he taken? Enough to sink him, Marcus replied, his voice grim. And enough to prove that Arthur Vance's original trust was tampered with. Julian didn't just inherit his position, he stole the voting rights from the other heirs, including you. A predatory smile touched Elena's lips. Julian thought he was preparing for a coronation. He had no idea he was building his own scaffold. 3 days until the launch, she whispered, looking out the window at the towering glass monolith that bore the Vance name. He thinks he's taking my chair at the head of the table. He has no idea I'm about to take the whole table. She tucked the drive into the hidden lining of her purse. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in years, Elena wasn't the one being hunted. She was the one holding the keys to the trap. The following afternoon, the silence of the high-security vault at Thorne and Associates was broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the climate control system. Elena Vance stood before a cold steel table, the air smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. Across from her, Marcus Thorne slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope toward her. His movements were precise, his expression grim. "It's more than just the voting rights, Elena," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper in the cavernous room. "I found the trail Julian tried to burn. He didn't just manipulate the trust. He's been using the Vance International Pension Fund as his personal collateral for a series of failing real estate gambles in Macau." Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the thick stock of the envelope. The physical weight of the evidence felt like a loaded weapon. She pulled out a single sheet, a bank statement with a forged signature that mimicked her own handwriting with terrifying accuracy. Julian hadn't just stolen her inheritance. He had set her up to be the fall girl if his house of cards ever collapsed. "He signed my name," she murmured, her thumb tracing the ink. The betrayal wasn't a sharp sting anymore. It was a cold, hard stone in her chest. "He's confident," Marcus warned, leaning back into the shadows. "He thinks you're too broken to look at the ledgers. He's already scheduled a press conference for the hour after the launch. He's going to announce a restructuring that effectively removes you from the board entirely." "Let him schedule it," Elena said, her voice devoid of emotion. She tucked the documents into her bag, the leather smooth and cool against her skin. The higher he builds his pedestal, the longer he has to scream on the way down. She left the vault and drove toward the Vance estate, the city blurred through the rain-streaked windows of her modest sedan. 2 days remained. The countdown was no longer a threat, it was a promise. That evening, the grand dining room of the Vance Manor was a theater of forced opulence. The scent of roasted lamb and expensive lilies hung heavy in the air. Arthur Vance sat at the head of the table, his eyes clouded but fixed on Elena as she took her seat. Julian sat opposite her, looking every bit the conquering hero in a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than the car Elena had driven to get there. "You're late, Elena," Claire Vance remarked, not looking up as she meticulously sliced her meat. "But then, I suppose time doesn't matter much when you have so little to do with it." Serena Vance giggled, her diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandelier. "Be nice, Mother. Elena's probably just busy packing. Julian mentioned that the guest house will be needed for the new chief operating officer starting next week." Julian sipped his wine, the dark liquid staining his lips. He didn't look at Elena. He looked through her, as if she were a piece of furniture he was planning to replace. "It's just business, Elena. You understand. The image of the company requires a certain caliber of presence. Having the disgraced heir lingering on the grounds isn't a good look for the investors." The rage spike hit Elena like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She felt the sharp corner of the digital drive in her pocket, a secret power humming against her thigh. She watched Julian tap his heavy gold signet ring against the mahogany table, the sound sharp and rhythmic, like a ticking clock. "I understand perfectly, Julian," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady. She picked up her water glass, the condensation chilling her palm. "You've always been so focused on the look of things." Julian finally met her gaze, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Exactly. And in 48 hours, the look will be perfect. I've even decided to move the family portraits. Yours is going into storage. We need the space for the commemorative plaque for the new wing. You're very sure of yourself, Arthur croaked from the end of the table. His voice was weak, but his gaze remained on Elena, a flicker of something hope or warning behind the haze. I have every reason to be, grandfather, Julian snapped, his arrogance peaking. He turned back to Elena, his eyes narrowing. Actually, I have a gift for you, a parting gesture. He reached into his pocket and tossed a small, velvet box across the table. It skidded to a halt near Elena's plate. She opened it to find a cheap, silver-plated keychain with the Vance International logo. Since you won't have a key to the building anymore, Julian laughed, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. I thought you might want a souvenir of the life you weren't smart enough to keep. Serena and Claire joined in the laughter, a chorus of entitlement that filled the room. Elena looked down at the trinket. It was a pathetic insult, a small-minded jab from a man who thought he had already won. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The irony was delicious. He was handing her a souvenir of a company he no longer truly controlled. Thank you, Julian, she said, her voice dropping an octave. She looked him dead in the eye, her expression unreadable. I'll keep this. It'll remind me of exactly what happened here tonight. Julian waved a dismissive hand. Whatever, just make sure your things are out by Friday. I don't want to have to call security on my own sister. It would be so dramatic. Oh, I think Friday will be plenty dramatic without security, Elena replied softly. She stood up, leaving her meal untouched. As she walked toward the door, she could hear Julian bragging to Claire about the luxury suite he'd booked for the launch after-party. He was talking about the vintage champagne, the guest list of elites, the dawn of his new empire. Elena paused at the threshold, her hand on the cold brass doorknob. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had the signatures. She had the offshore records. She had the original codicil, 48 hours. She stepped out into the hallway, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome. She pulled her phone from her bag and sent a single text to Marcus. The trap is set. Ensure the media links are live by 9:00 a.m. Thursday. She walked out into the night, the cool rain hitting her face. Julian thought he was preparing for his greatest triumph. He had no idea that the stage he had built was actually a scaffold, and she was the one with her hand on the lever. The countdown had reached its final phase, and for the first time in her life, Elena Vance wasn't afraid of the end. She was the one bringing it. The following afternoon, the Vance estate felt less like a family home, and more like a stage being dressed for a play that Julian Vance didn't realize was a tragedy. The air in the grand foyer was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of thousands of white lilies, their pale petals stark against the dark mahogany of the staircase. Elena Vance walked through the hall, her heels silent on the plush Persian rugs, watching as a small army of caterers polished silver that had belonged to her grandfather long before Julian had ever tried to claim it. She found him in the library, standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, the amber liquid catching the afternoon sun. He didn't turn when she entered. He simply watched her reflection in the glass with a look of bored superiority. The guest list is finalized, Elena, he said, his voice smooth and cold. I've taken the liberty of moving your seat to the far end of the table, near the service entrance. It's better if you stay out of the way while the board members and the press are focused on the transition. Elena didn't let the insult touch her. She walked to the desk, her fingers trailing over the cold, heavy brass of a paperweight. You're very concerned with optics today, Julian. Are you worried the camera might catch something you'd rather keep hidden? He turned then, a sharp, mocking laugh escaping his lips. He walked toward her, invading her personal space until the aggressive, woodsy scent of his expensive cologne filled her senses. Hidden? There's nothing left to hide. Tomorrow I stand on that stage as the sole successor. I've spent 5 years cleaning up the legacy your father left behind. Tomorrow is simply the funeral for the old ways. The audacity of his words sent a spark of heat through her veins, but she channeled it into a calm, steady gaze. She reached into her blazer pocket, her fingers brushing the corner of the original codicil Marcus Thorne had verified only hours ago. The paper felt like a live wire against her skin. "You should be careful with funerals," she said softly. "Sometimes, the person you think you're burying is the only one who knows where the keys are kept." Julian sneered, his lip curling in a display of peak arrogance. "Cryptic threats don't suit you. They make you sound desperate. You have no allies left, Elena. Even Serena agrees that your presence is distracting." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Serena Vance stepped into the room, draped in a floor-length silk gown that cost more than a year of a teacher's salary. She glanced at Elena with a look of profound irritation. "Julian, the photographer is asking about the family portrait," Serena said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "And Claire Vance is on the phone complaining that her jewelry hasn't been delivered yet. Honestly, Elena, why are you still lurking in here? You look like a ghost haunting your own house." "Ghost is exactly right," Claire said, appearing in the doorway behind Serena. The older woman's eyes were sharp and unforgiving. "One that needs to move on. We're building something here that doesn't include your sentimentality, Elena. You don't fit the brand anymore." The three of them stood in a semicircle of designer silk and expensive scotch, looking down at her as if she were an intruder in her own life. The rage spike was sharp, a physical weight in Elena's chest, but she held it. She welcomed it. "I'll leave you to your rehearsals," Elena said, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. She looked at Julian, holding his gaze until he was the one to blink. "But a word of advice for tomorrow. When you're standing at that podium, make sure you look at the faces in the front row. You might find that the foundation you've built your empire on is a lot thinner than you think." Julian dismissed her with a flick of his wrist, turning back to the window. "Enjoy your last night in the big house, Elena. The car for the airport leaves at dawn on Friday. Don't be late." Elena walked out of the library, the sound of their laughter following her down the hall. She didn't stop until she reached the privacy of her own room. She pulled out her phone and saw a single notification from Marcus. "Everything is uploaded. The moment the first guest scans their digital program tomorrow, the secondary link goes live. There's no way for him to stop the broadcast." Elena sat on the edge of her bed, the scent of the lilies from downstairs still clinging to her clothes. She looked at the portrait of Arthur Vance on her nightstand and felt a sudden, piercing clarity. Julian thought he was preparing for a coronation. He had no idea he was actually polishing the blade of his own guillotine. She closed her eyes, the countdown in her head hitting the 24-hour mark. Tomorrow, the Vance name would mean something again, but it wouldn't be what Julian expected. The evening arrived with a chilling precision, draped in the kind of artificial opulence that only the Vance family could conjure. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom of the estate was a shimmering sea of silk and ego. Elena stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand resting lightly on the cold, gilded railing. Below her, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of top-shelf champagne. This was Julian's night, or so he believed. He had spent a fortune on the floral arrangements alone, ensuring every surface reflected the image of a man in total control. She took a breath, feeling the weight of the small, encrypted device Marcus had given her tucked into the hidden pocket of her dress. It was a simple black silk gown, devoid of the flashy sequins Claire and Serena favored, but it fit her like armor. As she descended the stairs, the rhythmic click of her heels against the stone sounded like a countdown. Julian was already at the center of the room, holding court near a towering ice sculpture of the family crest. He looked every bit the successor in his midnight blue tuxedo, his laughter ringing out with a practiced, hollow warmth. When he spotted her, his smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the look of a predator who found a stray hair on an otherwise perfect kill. "Elena," he said, loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding board members. He didn't offer a drink. He simply looked her up and down with a sneer that felt like a physical slap. "I'm surprised you found something in the back of the closet that didn't smell of mothballs. Though I suppose a plain dress suits a plain role. Try not to stand too close to the guests. We wouldn't want them mistaking the hostess for the catering staff." A few of the younger associates chuckled, a sycophantic sound that rippled through the circle. Serena, standing at his elbow in a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, smirked into her crystal flute. "Don't be cruel, Julian," Serena purred, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "She's had a hard few weeks. It's difficult to keep up with appearances when you have so little to work with." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the phantom pressure of the evidence Marcus had secured, the digital trail of Julian's systematic theft from the family foundation. She met his gaze with a calm that seemed to unnerve him for a split second. "The evening is young," she said softly. "I think everyone will find exactly what they're looking for tonight." Julian waved her off with a flick of his wrist, turning back to Arthur Vance, who stood a few feet away, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. "Grandfather, you really should have insisted she stay in the library. This is a night for the future of the firm, not for relics of the past." The arrogance in his voice was a physical weight in the room. He moved away, leading the crowd toward the buffet, his hand possessively gripping the shoulder of a major investor. Elena watched him go, her pulse steady. She caught the eye of Marcus Thorne, who was standing near the tech booth at the far end of the hall. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The digital programs had been distributed. Every guest held a smartphone that was now a gateway to Julian's destruction. As the hour grew later, the tension in the room shifted. It was the wait for it moment she had practiced in her mind for years. Julian was at his peak, standing on the small mahogany stage at the front of the ballroom, preparing to deliver the keynote address that would solidify his position as the new head of the Vance Foundation. "Success isn't just about wealth," Julian proclaimed, his voice amplified and booming through the high-fidelity speakers. He gestured grandly to the room, his Rolex catching the light of the chandeliers. "It's about integrity. It's about the legacy my father and grandfather built, a legacy I have protected with every decision I've made." Elena stood near the back, partially obscured by a marble pillar. She watched as Claire Vance leaned in to whisper something to a socialite, her face glowing with the reflected glory of her son's performance. They were all so certain. They were all so blind. "I've seen the way this company has been whispered about," Julian continued, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial hum. "People think we've lost our way, but look around you. The Vance name is stronger than ever, and tonight I'm going to show you exactly how deep that strength goes." He signaled to the AV team. A large, high-definition screen behind him began to glow, ready to display the promotional video he had commissioned to highlight his charitable contributions. Elena looked down at her phone. A message from Marcus sat on the screen. "Link live in 10 seconds. They're all scanning." Across the room, she saw several guests frown at their devices. The digital programs, which were supposed to show the evening's menu and Julian's biography, had begun to flicker. The secondary link, the one Marcus had embedded into the QR codes, was overriding the house network. Julian didn't notice yet. He was too busy soaking in the applause, his chest puffed out, his chin tilted at an angle of supreme entitlement. He reached for a remote on the podium, his thumb hovering over the button that would start his presentation. "Before we begin the video," he said, his voice dripping with a final, condescending grace, "I want to thank my sister, Elena, for at least showing up. It's important for the world to see that even the less capable members of the family support the new regime." He pressed the button. The screen didn't show the gleaming towers of the Vance headquarters or the smiling faces of scholarship recipients. Instead, a grainy, high-contrast image of a bank ledger appeared, followed immediately by a recorded audio file that began to play over the ballroom's speakers. The voice was unmistakable. It was Julian, clear and cold, discussing the off-book reallocation of $5 million from the Children's Hospital Fund. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the clinking of a single dropped glass and the sudden, ragged intake of Julian's breath as he turned to look at the screen behind him. His face, usually so tan and composed, began to drain of color, turning a sickly, translucent gray in the harsh light of the projector. Elena stepped out from behind the pillar, the light catching the steady, cold fire in her eyes. The countdown was over. The broadcast had begun. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the very oxygen out of the room. The audio recording of Julian's voice had stopped, but the echo of his admission, the cold, calculated theft from a children's hospital, lingered in the air like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. The cloying fragrance of 1,000 white lilies, meant to signify the Vance family's purity and philanthropy, now felt like the funeral flowers for a dying reputation. Julian Vance's jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, his mouth working silently like a fish gasping for air. The tan he'd cultivated on his last business trip to the Maldives turned a translucent, curdled milk color under the harsh glare of the projector. A single bead of sweat broke from his hairline, carving a jagged path through the expensive foundation he used to hide his age. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, darted frantically toward the exits, then back to the screen, widening until the whites showed all the way around the irises. He looked less like a CEO and more like a cornered animal, realizing the cage was electrified. His hands, which had been so steady while holding a champagne flute moments ago, were now trembling so violently that he had to grip the edge of the podium to keep from collapsing. Arthur Vance stood slowly at the head table, his knuckles white as he leaned on his silver-headed cane. The patriarch didn't say a word, but the look of profound, icy disappointment on his face was a death sentence in itself. Beside him, Serena Vance had gone completely still, her hand pressed against her mouth as if to keep from being sick. Claire Vance, usually the first to spin a narrative, was frantically typing on her phone, her eyes wide with the realization that this was a fire no amount of PR could extinguish. "This is a fabrication," Julian finally choked out, his voice cracking. He looked toward the board members, his entitled arrogance attempting to reassert itself even as his world crumbled. "Elena, you've gone too far. This is a desperate, pathetic attempt to—" "It's a forensic audit, Julian," Elena said, her voice cutting through his panicked defense like a scalpel. She stepped into the center of the room, her heels clicking against the marble with a rhythmic, predatory precision. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. "Marcus Thorne spent 6 months tracing the digital breadcrumbs you thought you deburied. The ledger on the screen isn't a fake. It's the one you kept in the private server at the lake house." Marcus stood near the tech booth, holding a tablet. He nodded once, his expression professional and utterly unmoved by Julian's frantic gaze. "You told me I didn't belong in this world," she continued, stopping just feet away from him. The smell of his expensive cologne was now masked by the sharp, metallic scent of his fear. "You told everyone here that I was a liability, that I was lucky to even share your name." "I made you," Julian hissed, leaning over the podium, his face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You were nothing before I plucked you out of that library. Everything you have, every rag on your back, belongs to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the sound of social judgment shifting. The board members, men and women who had toasted Julian's brilliance only an hour ago, were now physically recoiling from him. Elena reached into her small evening clutch and pulled out a single, folded document. She didn't hand it to him. She handed it to Arthur. "Actually, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow reached every corner of the silent room. "Arthur and I had a long talk about the family legacy while you were working in the Maldives. He realized that the only way to save the Vance name was to cut out the cancer." Arthur looked at the document, then back at his grandson. "The board met in executive session this morning, Julian. Based on the evidence provided by Marcus and Elena, your shares have been frozen pending a criminal investigation. And as for the majority stake—" Arthur handed the paper back to Elena. "I don't just belong here, Julian," she said, meeting his horrified gaze with a look of absolute, chilling calm. "I'm the new chair of the board, and you have 10 minutes to leave this building before security escorts you out in front of the press waiting at the gates." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch him beg or scream. Elena turned her back on him, the silk of her dress whispering against the floor as she walked toward the exit. Behind her, the first sounds of the fallout began, the frantic whispers of the board, the heavy tread of security guards entering the room, and the sharp, pathetic sound of Julian Vance finally finding his voice, only to realize no one was listening anymore. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom hadn't even finished swinging shut behind Elena before the vacuum she left was filled by a roar of chaos. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, turned sour by the sudden, sharp tang of Julian's cold sweat. Julian lunged for the papers Arthur still held, his fingers clawing at the air like a drowning man reaching for a piece of driftwood. "This is a fabrication," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high, thin register that made several board members flinch. "She's been planning this. Marcus, you're in on it. How much did she pay you to forge these signatures?" Marcus Thorne didn't even blink. He stood with his hands folded behind his back, a pillar of stone amidst the storm. "The signatures have been verified by 3 independent forensic examiners, Julian, and the digital trail leads directly to your private server. There is no fabrication, only a record of your choices." Julian's face was no longer the mask of tanned, polished confidence it had been an hour ago. It was a ruin. The skin around his eyes had gone a sickly, translucent gray, and his lower lip trembled with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch. He looked smaller, the tailored shoulders of his Italian suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for a man who was shrinking in real time. The sweat was visible now, a greasy sheen breaking through his foundation, matting his carefully styled hair against a forehead that was suddenly mapped with deep, desperate lines of panic. Arthur Vance watched his son with a look of profound, weary disgust. "Enough," he said, the single word cutting through Julian's frantic babbling like a blade. "The police are already downstairs, Julian. I've spent 40 years building this legacy. I won't let you burn it down to cover the cost of your vanity." "Dad, please," Julian gasped, his knees hitting the plush carpet with a heavy thud. He looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face. He turned toward Claire Vance, his eyes wide and pleading. "Claire, tell them I was doing it for the family. You knew about the expansion. You knew we needed the liquidity." Claire stepped back, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she distanced herself from him. Her expression was one of cold, calculated survival. "I knew no such thing," she said, her voice dripping with artificial shock. "I am horrified, Julian, to think that you would use our family's name for such tawdry criminality. Arthur, I had no idea. I was as much a victim of his lies as anyone else." Serena stood by the window, her face pale as she watched her mother's instant betrayal. She looked from the sobbing man on the floor to the woman who had just erased 20 years of marriage in a single sentence. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic sound of heavy boots approaching in the hallway. 2 men in dark suits entered, their badges glinting under the sterile LED lights. They didn't look at the board members, their eyes were fixed solely on the man on the floor. "Julian Vance?" the lead officer asked. Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply stared at the floor, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. When the officers reached down to pull him to his feet, he didn't resist. He was limp, a discarded shell of the man who had spent the morning mocking Elena's modest upbringing. They led him out of the boardroom, his shoes scuffing pathetically against the floor. As they reached the lobby, the elevator doors slid open. Elena was standing there, her coat over her arm, waiting. She hadn't left the building yet. She had been waiting for this specific moment. The officers paused, allowing the path to clear. Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a manic, desperate rage. "You think you've won?" he spat, the words wet and ugly. "You're a Vance in name only, Elena. You're nothing. You'll always be the girl who didn't belong." Elena didn't flinch. She stepped closer until she was inches from him. The smell of his fear was palpable, a sharp contrast to the calm, floral scent of her own perfume. She reached out and adjusted his tie, her fingers steady as she straightened the silk. "You spent so much time worrying about who didn't belong here, Julian," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper that carried only to him. "You never stopped to realize you were the only one who didn't." She stepped back, her expression unreadable. "The press is waiting at the gates. I'd suggest you cover your face, though I suppose it's a bit late for your reputation now." She turned to the officers and gave a small, polite nod. "Thank you, gentlemen." The elevator doors began to close. The last thing Julian saw was Elena's calm, steady gaze, the look of a woman who had finally reclaimed what was hers. As the doors shut, the lobby went silent. Julian was led toward the glass front doors, where the flashes of a dozen cameras were already beginning to strobe against the pavement like lightning. Outside, the world was waiting to watch the fall of the man who thought he was untouchable. Inside, Elena stood alone in the quiet of the elevator, the weight of the last decade finally lifting from her shoulders. She pressed the button for the garage, her reflection in the polished brass doors showing a woman who was no longer a victim, but the architect of her own justice. The building behind her was already beginning to fracture, the Vance legacy shifting into new, steadier hands, while Julian was driven away in the back of a car that he would never be able to afford again. The reckoning was complete, but the silence she left behind was louder than any scream he could have mustered. 6 months had passed since the glass doors of the Vance Tower had closed on the life Elena once knew. The city had moved on to newer scandals, but inside the executive suite, the air felt different, cleaner. Elena Vance sat behind the expansive mahogany desk that had once been the seat of her father's power, and then, briefly, the throne of a man who had tried to dismantle her soul. The room smelled of fresh cedar and expensive ink, a sharp, grounding departure from the cloying scent of the designer cologne Julian had favored. She ran her thumb over the cool, heavy barrel of her fountain pen. It was a small weight, but it felt like an anchor. On the desk before her lay the final restructuring documents for the Vance Foundation. With one stroke of the pen, she would finalize the transfer of the last recovered assets into a trust for the families Julian had defrauded. It was the final stitch in a wound that had stayed open for far too long. Across town, in a cramped studio apartment that smelled of damp laundry and cheap takeout, Julian Vance stared at a stack of legal bills that he had no hope of paying. The designer suits were gone, sold off to a high-end consignment shop to cover a retainer that hadn't even kept him out of a plea deal. He checked his reflection in a cracked bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie that was frayed at the edges. There was no boardroom to impress now, only a harried public defender and a parole officer who didn't care about the pedigree of his surname. He remembered the way he had laughed when he'd poured wine over her dress at the gala, the sheer, intoxicating power of watching her shrink under the weight of his contempt. He had felt untouchable then. Now, the only thing he felt was the biting chill of a radiator that hissed but never produced heat. He reached for his phone, a habit of a lifetime, only to remember he'd had to downgrade to a prepaid model. No one called him anymore. The friends who had toasted his brilliance had vanished the moment the forensic audit went public. He was a ghost in his own city, a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails in the clubs he was no longer allowed to enter. The door to the office opened softly, the sound of a cane clicking against the polished hardwood floor marking the arrival of the family patriarch. Arthur Vance looked older, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by the stress of the past year, but his posture was straight. He moved to the window, looking out at the skyline he had helped build. "Thorne finished the final audit this morning," Arthur said, his voice carrying a quiet pride that Elena had spent a lifetime yearning for. "Every penny has been accounted for. Marcus is downstairs with the press, ensuring the narrative remains focused on the restitution, not the scandal." Elena looked up at her father. "Is it enough?" "It's justice," Arthur replied, turning to face her. "Whether it's enough is up to the people we're trying to help, but for the family, it's a beginning." She nodded, the ink on the document drying in the soft afternoon light. She had won. The Vance legacy was secure, the predator had been caged by his own greed, and the truth was a matter of public record. She had her name back, her dignity intact, and a seat at the head of the table she had once been told she didn't belong to. Yet, as Arthur left the room, Elena's gaze drifted to a silver-framed photograph tucked away on a lower shelf of the bookcase. It was a picture of her and Julian from a decade ago, taken during a summer at the coast. They were laughing, their arms linked, before the hunger for control had completely hollowed him out. She felt a sharp, familiar ache in her chest. Justice was a cold meal. It filled the stomach, but it didn't always warm the bones. She had dismantled a monster, but in doing so, she had finally accepted that the brother she thought she had never truly existed. The victory was absolute, but the silence in the room was a reminder of the cost. She stood and walked to the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city was beginning to glow, thousands of lights flickering on in the twilight. For the first time in years, Elena didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder. She was no longer waiting for the next blow to fall or the next insult to cut her down. She was the architect of this new quiet. She took a deep breath, the scent of cedar and rain filling her lungs, and turned away from the window to face the work that still remained.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.